Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. Yeah, so busy week in sports before we get started. I mean, geez, man.
What's going on?
It seems like the frenzy had started earlier than usual, but maybe it always works like this, and we just have more than usual.
Well, we traded Devontae Johnson for a Dante Jackson. So
yeah.
We only just a couple of consonants off. I mean, It's unbelievable.
You don't even have to learn a new name on that one. I mean, yeah, the Patriots, seems like we're just re-signing the Bill Belichick people. So I don't know what
Maybe they can re-sign Bill.
I mean, at this point, what changed here? But I don't know.
Maybe he's looking for a good assistance job these days.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have a lot of fun to talk about on this podcast today, so maybe we should just get going. I know.
Let's do it.
On this episode of the AAF Exchange, President Biden's budget proposal, Trump's call for a 10% tariff, and an update on the economy. Joining us is Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Doug, I'm surprised you haven't noticed that I'm wearing a tie 2 days in a row.
I did notice. I just didn't say anything. We want to reward good behaviors, Kyle.
Fair. All right, so before we jump into today's episode, Doug, what's been on your mind?
There was a federal court ruling that tossed out the National Labor Relations Board joint employer rule. Mm-hmm. So this has been one of the real political footballs in recent years. The issue is, what do you do when you have like a McDonald's franchise? Is McDonald's the corporation an employer of the folks at the franchise, or just the franchise? And the standard for a long time in common law was you had to have direct control over the employee. There's lots of things that the McDonald's company does, the training and the uniforms and all that, affect employees indirectly, but they don't directly control their hours and their hiring and things like that. Well, the Obama administration went for an indirect control standard, and the Trump administration came in and went back to the old standard. True to form, the Biden administration went pendulum back the other way. We're going to use the indirect control standard. The Chamber of Commerce sued on behalf of all businesses and of course threw it out, saying this is in conflict with all of the common law that we have on employment standards. Stop. And so that's great, but it's no good for the economy to have this thing go back and forth all the time. I'd like to see it settled. One way to settle it is for the Congress to pass a Congressional Review Act that says no, that rule is gone, and you can't replace it with a similar rule. Yeah. So House has done that. Senate could do it. Would this president sign it? Unlikely. But next Congress, you have the same possibilities.
Yeah. So it seems pretty logical that the economy likes stability. Do you think there's you said there's not really a likelihood that the president will sign it, but will this be a top agenda item, or are we going to be dealing with this at the next Democratic administration? Could this administration issue a different rule in this? What's the future hold on bringing it back? I would.
This moment in time, I think there are two people in the United States who care about this issue. That's you and me.
Yeah.
So it's hardly going to be at the top of any administration's list when they come in. It's just a constant irritant in the regulatory structure, because it really endangers the franchise business model in particular. And that's been the source of an enormous amount of growth in the U.S. So the sort of on-off nature of it, I think, just has to be ended somehow.
Yeah, well, hopefully, maybe one of our listeners will start caring about it just as much as we do.
Oh, there are people out there who care a fair amount,
and
I'm
we'll
sure.
Continue to grow and grow and grow, and we can start a movement. All right, let's jump into today's podcast topics. President Biden, of course, released his budget proposal for fiscal 2025. I know I'm setting myself up here, but what were the highlights?
Oh, well, this budget is a non-starter legislatively. Certainly, there's a lot of recycled ideas from the Build Back Better initiatives that couldn't pass when Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. It's a non-starter, especially from a serious fiscal policy perspective. The reality is that if you're going to make great progress in the growth of deficits and debt, you have to take on the growth rates of Social Security and Medicare. Medicare is growing at 7% a year in the next 10 years, Social Security at 5.5%. We don't have a revenue source that's going to grow that fast. You have to address that somehow. They're the biggest chunk of spending in the next 10 years, $32 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's it. That's the game. Budget doesn't do anything on that front. So it's a non-starter from that perspective. Instead, it's just a faux fiscal responsibility, right? They raise a lot of taxes, $4.9 trillion in their accounting. I'll come back to that. And then they spend a lot more, and they end up reducing deficits by over $3 trillion over the next 10 years. And they're going to tout that. The president's committed to deficit reduction. What they're not going to tout is the games that get you to those numbers. Gordon Gray did a really nice piece on this. If you look at the CBO baseline, which is what happens under current law if you leave it on autopilot, and you look at the OMB baseline, which is the starting point for their budget, they differ in revenues by $2.8 trillion. So the president's raising nearly $3 trillion in taxes and not talking about it, not explaining what it is. That's a lot of taxes.
Yeah.
Then you layer on top the 4.9, you're at 7.7. They're doing the same thing on the spending front. They have $2.2 trillion in spending that they aren't owning up to. So it's also a budget that's full of gimmicks, and that's not unusual. Let's face it, but not a stellar point on it.
Yeah, I mean, you've been around for a while. You were the Congressional Budget Office Director. You've been around this issue for quite a long time. Gimmicks are always part of the game. But, one of the issues that I think we always seems to always come up when we talk about fiscal policy and budgets is the unsustainable federal debt over the long term. I mean, the president's budget and certainly Congress generally has failed miserably at fixing this issue. What does the president's budget suggest regarding debt reduction? And what is actually needed to get on the path to fiscal sustainability here?
Well, the president's budget's terrifying from a debt management point of view. Under the president's budget, interest costs will exceed the spending of every agency of the U.S. government within a year. Okay, that's unthinkable. And debt will go to the highest in history relative to GDP. Not as high as they claim it would be under their baseline, right? Remember, because they are doing some deficit reduction, $3 trillion. The reality is that if you want to stabilize the debt relative to GDP, given where we are, you need to do about $8 trillion of serious deficit reduction over the next 10 years. No one is coming close to that.
Yeah.
So we are really, really, really in a bad place fiscally. It's going to take serious work to get out of it, and this isn't serious work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of that budget, and you started talking about the tax hikes in this bill a little bit. So let's dive a little deeper into those proposed tax. A few weeks ago, you wrote a dish on how the administration's math doesn't add up on this to deficit reduction by tax increasing. Walk us through your concerns.
Well, I mean, the tax increases in this budget are driven by politics. Mm-hmm. There's a famous Louisiana congressman who said, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree." Right? That's what's going on here. Right? Yeah. We're going to raise the corporate rate to 28%. Just not a smart move in my view. We had the rate at 35%. We lost 10 headquarters a year for a decade. We had huge political fights over it. We cut the rate to the middle of the pack for the developed world. 21% is by no means at the bottom end, and we haven't lost a headquarters since. This is an invitation to going back to those bad old days. So that 28% rate, I think, is a bad idea. They raised their 15% alternative book tax to 21%. That's a pretty unproven and unwieldy tax. We tried it in 1986 and it was gone by 1989. We'll see how long this one lasts. Then they signed on to this international global minimum tax. And then we start, quadruple the stock buyback tax, add a whole new Medicare tax on investment income and pass-through income, a millionaire's tax for those people who have more than $150 million in wealth. I mean, it's just tax rich people, tax corporations. There'll be no pain for the middle class. It'll all be fine.
Yeah.
There will be pain for the middle class. This much tax increases on Americans' businesses are going to have big impacts on the growth of the economy. There is no growth in this budget, and that is the number one problem we face. We're growing too slowly on average, the trend, and that frustrates people. It's a recipe for stagnation and a lot of political despair.
Mm-hmm. On the other side of the ledger, you mentioned the famous saying from the congressman. I heard it recently. Somebody said, well, maybe now it's time to start saying, don't cut my spending, don't cut your spending, cut the guys behind the tree spending. I mean, but like,
got to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be some cuts on that side of the ledger, a lot of cuts on that side of the ledger, and most of it flows from Social Security and Medicare.
Right. Entitlement spending.
And yet we still don't hear about that conversation on the campaign trail, in Congress, on Sunday morning talk shows.
We have heard about it on the campaign trail. President Biden has said, I'm not touching Social Security and Medicare.
Yes,
Trump has said the same thing. I mean,
right.
Then he sort of undid it on CNBC the other morning, so now people are just confused. I mean, there has to be an honest conversation about the fact that, of the $82 trillion we're going to spend over the next 10 years, 50 of it's in entitlements and 32 of that's Social Security and Medicare. That's where the money is. How fast do you want Warren Buffett's Social Security benefit to grow?
Yeah.
My current goal is 0. But, but you can't get both sides to agree to that. And that to me is perplexing. The left is willing to tax Warren Buffett infinitely.
Yeah.
But they will not cut his Social Security benefits. I don't understand that.
That's a little wild of a concept to get your head around.
Yes.
What happens next? I mean, obviously this is dead on arrival in Congress, but what happens next in this budget process? In the backdrop of we haven't finished the last budget process, last appropriations
so what happens
process.
next is we go back to last year, and we, by March 22nd, pass the final 6 appropriations bills. I think that will happen, to be honest. And at that point, nothing happens.
Yeah.
Like, when we get to September 30th and we go back on the continuing resolution train, this is going to be without any drama. Both sides are going to want to just put the budget on autopilot and go campaign. Mm-hmm. So they'll do a CR till just before Thanksgiving, and then they'll come back and do a CR to the early in December. Then they'll come back and do a CR until Christmas Eve, so that we're here on Christmas Eve, because you got to be.
Right. Well, that's a nice... optimistic view of the future, I'll say. I'll just say, I don't know how else to put it.
Here's the other budget forecast, which is somewhere in October we'll get peak lame duck mania. Like, people, we'll do that in the lame duck. We'll do that in the lame duck. They don't get anything done in the lame duck. So take all that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's fair. Did you just have a Freudian slip and say lame Doug, by the way, instead of lame duck?
No, I said lame duck. Lame Doug I live with.
Okay. Let's talk about trade. Former President Trump and presidential candidate Donald Trump, I guess now, has proposed a 10% tariff on all goods imported into the U.S. We've done a ton of research saying this is not a good idea.
Right.
It was talked about, I think, on CNBC. Our research specifically was mentioned during that interview. What are the drawbacks of that?
Number one, tariffs are taxes. Mm-hmm. The tax base is imports, but they're taxes. And to say that raising taxes on the middle class is a terrible idea, and that either President Trump or anyone else, no, we're not going to do that. But to levy or keep in place tariffs is doing exactly the same thing. So it's economically illogical to sort of rely on these tariffs this way. This 10% across the board tariff is a recipe for real problems, because you're going to distort the patterns of trade. People are going to try to do things in the U.S. that they previously did outside. That's what they think of as the good news, but they aren't in the U.S. for a reason. They're too expensive, they're less high quality, and they take resources away from things we do well. And so you're really slowing the U.S. economy. You're pushing it into a less efficient, less productive configuration. That's not a good idea at all. It picks an enormous fight with the rest of the world. So you are now taking your most important trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and whacking them in defiance of the U.S.-Canadian-Mexico free trade agreement. That
was under him, by the way.
That was under him. Yes, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And they'll retaliate, and so now you've got another set of problems, because you can't get the export sales you used to, and you have to start trying to sell those in the U.S., and that doesn't work very well. So it's hard to defend this on the logic, but that's not how it's being sold. It's being sold as I'm gonna, stand up to the rest of these guys who've been cheating us.
Yeah.
That's how he talks about it. That's not a particularly well researched fact. It's not true at all. But it's a dangerous and provocative move. He's paired it, by the way, with a promise to hit China with a 60% tariff. What that's going to do is, sort of just whipsaw Mexico, because they're going to try to take every Chinese good and sort of assemble it in Mexico and ship it to the U.S. instead of directly, avoid the tariff. So you just rearrange the trade patterns. But now Mexico's going to be hurt on one hand, helped on the other, and they're just going to try to figure out what hit them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, this proposal is on the backdrop of consumers already paying a ton for a lot of products. So, I mean, it's just going to make the problems that they face even worse.
If you don't like high prices, stop putting regulations and taxes on the production of them, on goods and services, and the prices won't be as high. It's pretty simple.
But yeah, all right. Let's do a trivia question, huh? After that great, great topic. This is a budget one, so right up your alley. Over the last
setup.
Over 10 years, what average level of taxation does President Biden's budget for FY25 propose, which is higher than any 10-year period in the history of modern U.S. tax system?
I think I don't know if it reaches 24 or averages 24. I'm going to say it averages 23.
So the fact of the day the other day had it at 19.7%.
Okay. Yeah, it's certainly higher. It gets up. He gets spending up to 24. That's right.
Yeah.
And then the deficit, and then the taxes are up to 19.
Yeah, it was astonishing.
It's amazing.
It was an astonishing. What struck me the most in that when I read that fact of the day in the Daily Dish was, which by the way everyone should sign up for, which is higher than any 10-year period in the history of modern U.S. tax system.
Oh yeah,
that was very striking.
Every budget he has proposed has had that characteristic. He has always advocated levels of taxation that are unprecedented in the United States.
Every single
Biden budget.
That's astonishing.
And higher levels of spending as well. I mean, the Biden budgets advocate for regular spending matching the peaks of the COVID response. Like so, every year is an emergency in a Biden budget.
Wow, that's astonishing. I mean, yeah. Let's just move on and talk about the economy.
Sure.
So the state of the economy seems like a regular segment at this point.
Sure.
Look at the numbers from this week. The consumer price index showed inflation was going in the wrong direction. I know we got PPI this morning. You were just on Maria Bartiromo this morning talking about this.
Bit hot, yes.
Bit hot. So what happened?
Well, I think the right way to think about it is in 2023, everything broke our way on the inflation front. We got big productivity boom. We got a big labor supply boom from the immigration. So the flip side of the crisis at the border is good news on the inflation front. And those things are stopping. And we got, especially on the top line, a big decrease in energy costs. That's a signature. So the CPI and the PPI top lines are much lower than are the core, and that's all energy. So PPI year over year is 1.6%. That's much higher than expected. It was supposed to be 1.1, but 1.6 sounds like a pretty good number. That's all energy. You take out the energy, and you're back up in the twos. So I think the right way to think about it is both the CPI and the PPI tell us that inflation has come down, but has sort of stalled in its descent somewhere in the 2.5% to 3% range, depending on which indicator you look at. It's been that way for 2-3 months, depending on which series you're looking at. That's a concern. It certainly is ammunition against the Fed cutting. There's no reason to cut until you are confident, as the chairman always says, that you will see inflation return to and stay there.
Yeah.
And they can't be confident right now. The trouble, of course, is that at the same time, the economy is, in my view, weakening. I've been worried about this for a while.
Yeah.
I've been worried about the business fixed investment in particular. It got revised up a little in the fourth quarter, so it looks better in the rearview mirror, but the durable goods orders and leading indicators of CapEx still aren't very strong. And the households are starting to show some signs of weakness. We've seen the growth rate of real disposable income go from 4% to 2%. So how are you going to keep spending? Retail sales were weak again in the report we got this morning, as they were in January. That's not great. And we're starting to see, consumer sentiment went down the last time we measured it. We got the small business confidence index on Monday. It fell. It's now just above the lowest levels recorded at the peak of the pandemic. So there's not a lot of optimism out there, and the places that were carrying the economy look to be taking a little bit of a ding. So I worry still.
Yeah, it really seems like I think we can. I'm pretty confident, and I'm not an economist at all. I'm pretty confident in saying the June cut is off the table at this point.
I think so. I don't see how they cut.
Based off this report, they would have to see like something drastically different in May.
The recipe for a
April,
cut
May.
is for the economy to just visibly slow down. If you see a jump in new claims for UI, which we didn't see this morning, that'll wake them up. You start getting monthly spending reports that are negative numbers. That'll wake them up.
Yeah.
They're not going to, I think, have the luxury of a preemptive cut aiming for a soft landing. They're going to have a cut, which is oh my God, gotta apply some juice here because the economy is weak. That's my concern.
Yeah. Are we still? I know we don't like to do cuts before the November election, so.
Certainly August to November, window they try to try not to move.
Will August be sort of the last possible chance to do it before we get to November?
They will do what they need to on the merits. I do have a lot of confidence in the Fed. They would prefer to not cut, say, October 1st or November 1st.
Right.
That's playing into the politics, and they don't really want to end up there.
Interesting. All right. Well, Doug, thank you for joining us. That's all we have to talk about today. I'm sure we will talk about a lot of these issues going forward and continue to have some fun on the podcast.
Love it. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.